Hi folks, it's Connie from Faff Designs. Welcome to my furniture painting YouTube channel. I am going to show you today how I got this Indian inspired kind of look on these three nest of tables. They didn't play ball, not gonna lie. It was one of those that I almost set fire to several points during the week, but we got there in the end, and I'll explain how I did it, how I got there, and some of the fails along the way. So these started out waxed, which needed stripping off. I do have another video on my YouTube channel if you want to see how that's done. So I'll fast forward that bit because it's just the same, basically repeating myself in another video. I'm not going to repeat it over and over again. And also with my fat fingers, I hit the manual focus button on my camera. So throughout the course of this video, there is some slight blurring, but I will talk you through what I'm doing anyway. So I am applying a base coat of Dixie Belle's mermaid tail all over the tables to start off with. You can see just in the left, I've got a little assistant helping me out with the other two tables as well. When I'm painting tables like this, I generally start upside down, and I generally start upside down with most pieces, to be fair, but definitely something like this where you can see the underneath of a piece, I always flip them upside down and work that way first. That way you don't have to turn it over and place your freshly painted surface on the floor. Okay, so this is part of the bit that was quite blurry, which I apologise for, but again, I hit that manual focus button on my camera, didn't realise, and obviously this is the only footage I have. So I went in with a plastic spatula from Dixie Belle Paint, and I applied flamingo really randomly over the piece with the spatula. This kind of gives texture. It also gives an impression of paint that might have chipped or peeled away, and I'm just building up some layers, and I just want that kind of contrasting colour with the mermaid tail. So this shot is still a little bit blurry, apologies, but as you can see, I'm taking the flamingo colour and I'm just applying it mainly around the edges of the table, just catching those edges and also those metal hinge things that are going around the corners of the piece. I'm also concentrating my flamingo colour on those areas, and that's just really to kind of give an impression of flaking paint like I mentioned before. Then the next colour that I'm going to layer over the top is actually really similar to mermaid tail but slightly paler, and it's called the Gulf. So you can see there just where I've applied it on the top, I'm going straight over, and I'm using a dry Dixie Belle brush. This one's called the Belle brush. It's a natural bristle brush, but it's a very soft natural bristle brush. And this is just going to basically just start adding those layers all together. The reason I'm using a natural bristle brush is because I'm going to distress this piece. So I do want a little bit of movement, a little bit of texture in the application of my paint. I don't want it super smooth because when it comes to distressing later on, it's not going to be effective if I have a really smooth finish. So that colour, which I'm not even sure if I mentioned the name of the colour, it's called the Gulf, the turquoise colour that I added over the top. That colour was set to dry one side. I let it completely dry, and I'm just ever so grateful that this seems to be fairly in focus because it is quite a detailed clip. So I'm using the silkscreen stencils in the pattern Mandala, and I'm just picking out some very, very small areas of the pattern to basically give a kind of almost hand-painted look to these tables. So I'll give you a little bit of a backstory about why I'm trying to create this look. A while ago, I actually ordered some vintage Indian block printing blocks which are traditionally used in fabric printing. And I ordered them wanting to use them on furniture, but they didn't quite work. Number one, because they're vintage. Number two, because they are designed to work on kind of more of a softer surface. And obviously furniture is not soft. So it's kind of not the greatest result. So I'm trying to replicate that kind of look with a silkscreen stencil. Silkscreen stencils differ from a standard stencil because they have an adhesive backing. They also have a mesh in the negative space rather than just an empty hole, which means you can get a much more intricate pattern and they are less likely to bleed through because they've got the adhesive backing. There's a number of different ways that you can apply silkscreen stencils or paint through the silkscreen stencils. I'm using a brush here. You can use the squeegee tool, which comes in the pack, and that gives a far more crisp finish to the pattern. You can also use a thingamajig tool, which is available from Dixie Belle. You can use a sponge dabber. You can use loads and loads of different ways to stencil. I'm using a very small stencil brush to get the pattern onto my piece. The reason I'm using a brush is because I want to kind of replicate that stamped or hand stamped or even hand painted kind of look. If you want a more crisp finish to the pattern, then I'd advise on either using a sponge or using the squeegee tool, which you get in the pack. You'll see as well that I'm working quite quickly with this. That's because the mesh in that negative space, so the pattern area basically, if you get a buildup of paint in there and that paint dries, then obviously that's going to have a detrimental effect on your pattern. So Dixie Belle advised that you wash the silkscreen stencils between use. They are reusable. You can get up to 10 uses before the adhesive starts to kind of get less sticky. But I'm working really quick because number one, I like to break rules, and number two, I've got quite a lot to stencil on these legs. I've got 3 tables. Each table has obviously got 4 legs. So if I washed it each time in between, I'd be there forever. So I'm working really quick to just make sure that that paint is not going to be drying on my silkscreen stencil in between my applications. And we're back to a blurry picture again, sorry. But I just wanted to show you that I'm using a very slightly different pattern. Again, from the mandala pack, it's just a bit of the stencil that I've cut out. And I'm just using that around the very top edge of each one of my tables. And what I should have mentioned is the colour that I used for my stencils is Antebellum Blue. But if you miss any of the colours that I've used, I will list them all in the description below, as always. Next step is when the stencil was completely dry, I then went in with my spatula and just applied a little bit more of that flamingo, which is a coral. We've got a blurry image again, I'm so sorry. But I went in and applied a little bit more of that flamingo colour again, just to kind of add to the layers, which hopefully is going to look kind of authentic when we distress back later on. I also went back in with mermaid tail as well. Each time I'm applying a new layer of colour, I have waited for the previous colour to dry. I don't want the colours to mix together, so I'm waiting for the colours to dry, and I'm just going back in with mermaid tail. That was the base colour that I used, so I'm kind of tying it all together, hopefully, with an application of that, just picking up in certain areas, not too much mermaid tail at this point. And then I am going to take my electric sander and I'm going to sand everything back. So this is my preferred way of distressing with my electric sander, mainly because I don't want dust flying around the air because I've got really sensitive eyes. And secondly, it's really quick. If I was to do this by hand, it would take a lot longer, but you do have to go carefully if you're doing it with an electric sander, because this is freshly painted paint, freshly coated paint, freshly painted paint. You get the gist. So we've applied our paint quite recently. It hasn't had time to fully cure. So if you're not careful, you can end up taking the paint back right the way back to bare wood if you're not careful. So I'm using, I think it was a 220 grit paper on my sander, and I'm using a very, very light hand. I'm not digging in, I'm not pressing on hard. I'm just kind of running it over and getting the desired amount of distressing that I am looking for. Okay, so I've distressed them all over to how I want them to look, and now I'm going to apply a whitewash all over them. This is going to give a sort of sun bleached effect. It's also going to kind of age them. So as well as using more antiquing methods, you know, traditionally a brown wax or a brown glaze, you can actually use a whitewash to age your pieces. This is just going to give it a more faded look as opposed to an antique-y look. So I have got in the bowl watered down paint. The colour that I'm using is Fluff, and I've just added quite a lot of water in there because Fluff is quite pigmented for a white, so the coverage is pretty good. You can see there it's pretty good for a white, and that's got quite a lot of water in. So I'm just applying it in small sections, and when I've let the paint sit on the surface for a few seconds, you don't want to leave it too long because we haven't sealed this paint, so it's going to sink into the paint underneath. You just need to wipe the excess off with a rag, and that'll give you a kind of whitewash finish. You can also get the same effect with a white glaze or a white wax, but I'm just using a whitewash paint for this particular piece. Okay, so I thought I was coming towards the end of these tables. I was kind of liking where they were going, and I decided to apply a top coat to seal it all in. So we'd obviously got quite a lot of layers there. We'd done the stenciling, and I'd also done the whitewash. So I wanted to just lock all that in because my plan was to use a coloured wax over the top just to add a little bit of depth and age. And so I just wanted to lock all that in, give it a good base coat. The reason I chose a clear coat over a wax for this particular piece is that usually these kind of tables get used for popping drinks on. So I just wanted to give it a little bit more protection with a clear coat versus what they would have if I'd have used a wax. So the clear coat dried, and naturally I pulled towards my Best Down Wax in brown, which is going to give a kind of antique look around the hinges and corners where I'm applying it with the French tip brush. However, it was at this point that I realised I'd made a grave mistake with the brown wax. I didn't love it, and yeah, I kept going basically. I did all 3 tables with the Best Down Wax in brown. I only used a little bit, and I'd only gone around the sort of corners where those metal kind of hingy things are, whatever they are, hinges. So I'd kind of only gone around there just to add a little bit of age. But when I'd finished, I realised I really did not like it. So, dun dun dun, I decided to take the wax off. Now, Best Down Wax is a water-based wax, which means you can easily remove it with either a baby wipe like I'm using here, or you can use a rag that's damp, paper towel, whatever. You can take it off really, really easily. This was, as soon as I finished the last table, I knew I'd made a massive mistake. So I went straight in and took it off. Even when this wax has cured, you can still reactivate it. It takes a little bit more scrubbing, but you can do it. But the sooner you can remove it, the better, and the easier it is. So wax has been removed, the tables have dried, we're back to where we were after I top coated them. And I stood there for a little while just looking at them and realised they just needed a little bit of sparkle, I think. They just needed something just to liven them up. The whitewash had kind of done the trick and dulled them down, but maybe a little bit too much. I don't know. They were just lacking something. So I went in with a Dixie Belle synthetic brush. They're super soft, and I'm using a colour that I've never used before. It's from the Moonshine Metallics range, and it's called Pacific. So the Moonshine Metallics range are super pretty. They are the Metallics range from Dixie Belle, and they are more of a sheer coverage. what that means is they work better with a colour underneath that is very similar to help build coverage of them. So because I'd used turquoise underneath the colour that I'm applying now, it kind of just made that colour pop. It's a beautiful aqua kind of turquoisey colour. It just obviously is a metallic shade. But I'm dry brushing it. I'm using a very, very small amount of the paint. What I'm doing is just dipping the paintbrush in the pot, and then I'm rubbing the majority of the paint off onto my rag, and I'm just feathering it over really, really lightly over certain areas to basically just give it a little bit of a shimmer, give it a little bit of a sheen. This colour is also going to add a little bit more depth to the overall piece. And it's also going to just tie all of those colours together that's layered underneath and give a cohesive look to the tables. Okay, so we've done our dry brushing with the Pacific colour. Now, I like them better than what I did with the brown wax, but I still felt like they were missing something. So I sent a picture of them as they were to Jodie, who is also a brand ambassador for Dixie Belle Paint. She's my friend, and she's got her own YouTube channel. Check her out. She does really, really colourful pieces as well. And she suggested Gilding Wax. Now, I do love a bit of Gilding Wax. I very often use it on handles and hinges, hardware, those kind of things. But it wasn't really something that I considered for these. And initially, I was sort of not keen. I was like, not really sure if it'll work. And I'd actually convinced myself I was going to sand these down and repaint them. But I came back from a dog walk and decided that I wasn't really going to be losing anything if I tried a little bit metallic. So I used a little bit of copper just on the hinges, and it worked. Hey presto, it worked. So I went in with the copper on my finger, and that's just because I didn't want full coverage of the copper. I didn't want these to look brand new because it wouldn't fit with the style of the tables. And then I also used a little bit of bronze gilding wax on a makeup brush just to darken that copper ever so slightly in certain areas, just because, again, didn't want these looking brand new. The gilding wax is very, very highly pigmented, so that just basically knocked that copper down a little bit and stopped it being so brand new and shiny. I'd also like to point out that it was at this point that my other half, Andy, realised that the automatic focus had been switched off by my fat fingers, and he switched it back on for me. So this bit is in focus. And that's that. They were finished. And it just proves that sometimes you do have to kind of keep going and trust the process. I say it a lot, but I lost the faith on these. So thanks to Jodie for the suggestion of Gilding Wax. There's a couple of close-ups. And here is the final staged image. So thank you for watching the video, and hopefully that will explain the process behind some of the stuff that I create. Doesn't always go according to plan, but that's life, and at the end of the day, it's only paint. So thanks for watching again, and make sure you're subscribing to my YouTube channel.